I want to acknowledge that Jamil Smith's father, Johnny Smith, is here tonight with us, Mr. whom we are so grateful. And I want to acknowledge Mike Crowley, because the whole reason I'm here is all about the effort that Mike Crowley has made to harness me here multiple times now. And for those of you who are graduating, I'm sorry, you're really going to be sick of me by the time I'm done, because I am giving the commencement. But Mike and I talked about who we wanted to bring in, and so I am, my goodness, what an honor to share the stage with Jamil and Wes. And it's not even because they're both from Ohio, as I am. I mean, that's wonderful. But they have gone so beyond in terms of the reach of their work, the mission of the work, right? And I basically want them to talk. You've heard plenty from me in the last few months. And my gosh, we had such a spirited discussion at dinner, and we'll get to that, right? But first, I just want you to talk, if you wouldn't mind a little bit. What is it like to be you right now in the field of journalism? You're doing very different work in some ways, right? You're both friends, so you know each other, which is wonderful. I feel like we're family up here on stage, which is just such a great feeling. Who wants to go first? Okay, so Wes told me Jamil's going first.
Age before beauty. So I think what's it like to be in this business right now? It's very obviously tumultuous time. It's a very I think there's a time when, you get into this business and, there wasn't, maybe as much policing of thought on, who are you for, who are you against, et cetera. And especially as an opinion writer, you feel compelled or pushed to maybe take takes that, you're not necessarily prepared to do. And I think there's a lot of people who don't understand what we do as journalists. And so that they expect us to kind of react in the same way maybe that everyone else reacts. And I want to make sure that I have a learned opinion about everything that I'm talking about.
Why does that matter? Can you talk a little bit about why that matters?
Yeah, why that matters is because I think, first of all, there's your integrity as a professional. You want to make sure that you have the facts behind what you're saying or opining about. And then second of all, you want to make sure that, hey, my goal in this business is to make sure that my readers, my audiences are informed. And informed, as my old boss, Rachel Maddow, used to say, increasing the amount of useful information in the world. Well, I can't do that if I'm just kind of going off the cuff based upon my emotions of whatever may be happening on TV or whatever live event that's taking place. I have to make sure that I have done the reporting, I've done my homework.
Wes, you've been very outspoken about the profession. And if you wouldn't mind, I'd like you to talk a little bit about it, as well as where you see your role now.
Sure. Yeah, well, my mom used to always tell me my mouth would get me in trouble, and she was right. I think that Dean McKay, the editor of the New York Times, says that each generation gets to build its own journalism. Each generation of journalists gets to build and construct its own journalism, and he frames that as a good thing. And I have taken to stealing that line from him because I think it's a smart one. I think that we're in a moment where we have a rising generation of not just journalists, but also consumers, and who have grown up in an environment that is fundamentally different than the one that so many of us who are currently in newsrooms grew up in, right? Even as I'm like the young radical, I grew up with a pretty traditional news diet. I've worked for newspapers, and 60 Minutes has been my career trajectory, right? I'm not a Gawker Deadspin person. I'm not an internet blogger. There's just not the space that I've been in. I've been very relatively traditional journalistic path. But when I talk to students, which is a fair amount, I'm teaching at Georgetown now, I taught in Colorado prior to that, they grew up in an environment completely different than the one that I came up in not that long ago, right? I grew up in a house where the first person up would go bring the newspaper in, where we would watch the local news at 6 or 7 p.m., where eventually we had to figure out how the dial-up worked on the internet, right? You've got a generation of people not that far behind me who have a completely different experience as it relates to how they access news and information, how they think about things like online marketplaces, and how they think about the idea of the public square and what that is and what it looks like, what their expectations are of the storytellers and what trust looks like and means to them. And they think about privacy very differently, right? And they think about the ideas of harassment or what you should have to encounter or what you shouldn't in ways that are just very different. And one of the things the example I always use is that if you were to pitch the phone book today you wouldn't be able to get it approved. Wait, you're gonna take everyone's cell phone number and drop it off at everyone's house? And anyone, like, no way. Like, the massive invasion of privacy. We would never, like, there's no way a group of 20-year-olds would agree to that. Right?
Yeah.
And so understandably, generations of people who grew up where that's how the world works might have some different ideas about how those two things. And so I think that, but I also think that in our moment, going back to my paraphrase of DPK earlier, I think we're in such a destabilized moment, nationally and internationally. And in this moment, one of the through lines is the distrust of institution, right? This is not a unique media issue at all. Distrust in government, distrust in the banking system, in the military, in the financial system, in democracy.
Yeah.
And I think that in those moments, it's important for us to think about what are our values, but then also to think about what are the things that we do out of habit, that aren't really value, but that are habits, because this is the way it works. Because we used to create a physical newspaper that had to be distributed this way, and so this is why we have this divide or this thing. What are the things that are actually core value, and what are things that are adaptable, that are adjustable? And I think that I think that that's really important, right? I think that like I said, I think our audiences, the emerging news consumer audience, is just functionally very different than it has been previously in terms of, again, some of their values, their lived experiences, their expectations of us. And so I think for me, in so much as I have been outspoken, which I certainly have been, I think, look, I think that there are two different types of media critics, right? There are people who want to drive distrust in media, who decide that the media is the enemy, and then there are people who criticize because they love the media and the institution, believe it's really important, and are hoping to sharpen it. And so my hope is just to be in the latter, not.
Well, that raises the question then, right? I mean, Jamil and I were talking earlier today, and I said when we think about how we criticize our own profession, it made me think of the Reverend William Sloane Coffin's definition of a true patriot. It's the one who has a lover's quarrel with their country, right? Which to me sounds very similar to what we're talking about here. Public distrust is, we always say at all-time low. Let's just say it's low, right? And I'm married to a member of Congress who loves to point out that our numbers are actually lower than theirs some weeks. It doesn't last. I always love pointing that out to him. Aren't you glad you're not in this marriage? Oh, honey, look at this week's numbers. But the point of it is, we have work to do. We have work to do, and neither of you are responsible for distrust.
Certainly not. No.
But you must, I mean, let's be honest. Where did this happen? Were you talking about fake news? Were you calling the press, the journalists, the enemy of the people? No, right? I mean, but yet here we are. We end up being the repositories for all the distrust. So my question to each of you is this: how do we regain? Is it regainable? I suppose we should start with that premise, and then how do we do that?
Well, I'm going to adopt the James Baldwin line. I'm not a pessimist because I'm alive. So I definitely believe it's regainable. I think it's something, and also I think that still there's a lot of it left. A lot of people still, even if they may hate the media or may say something bad about the media, they depend upon us to do our jobs as best as we can. And there are a lot of people who really do value our work. So let's make sure we stimulate that. But second of all, I definitely think that it's regainable because, first of all, the two of you, are in there teaching young people about exactly what kind of journalism we need to be building. I think one of the things we were talking earlier about the possibility of me doing the same thing, and one of the reasons why I think that's important is that because we are in the process, as we're in the midst of this evolving new journalism, we need to teach a generation that frankly didn't grow up with paper in the driveway, and all they need to do is just roll over and click on their phone, and then where are they getting that news? They're getting it from TikTok, they're getting it from Twitter, they're getting it from a lot of unverified, unprofessional sources, and I'm not denigrating that because I, one time, was one of those people on Twitter, who was not a journalist, and just not spouting off necessarily, but just being part of the economy of ideas. To me, I think we need to find ways to welcome those people in, and say, hey, even if you're not a professional journalist, we can make sure that you are not only heard, you are respected, and we need to hear what your market demands are. As consumers, we need to hear what people are demanding from their journalism right now, and basically respond to those needs. And
what do you think some of those needs are? I mean, you certainly are hearing from readers directly, right?
Yeah, in all sorts of ways. I think that
let's talk about the good ones.
I won't talk about the handwritten letters.
That look like ransom notes, the ones that paste the letters.
I'm right along.
Yeah, right.
But as far as the people who I think come to me with genuine constructive concerns, say, hey, I want to be able to trust people who are, giving me this information, and I want to be able to then convey and pass on that trust, share that trust with my neighbors, with the people who I work with the people in my family, and know that we're all able to at least have a baseline sane conversation. How do we in the press play into that? How do we help establish that baseline or reestablish it when so many, frankly, are dependent, their power is dependent upon upsetting that balance? And it's a very tough thing for us to do, and frankly, I don't think necessarily should be the responsibility purely of journalists to do that. We are here to tell the stories, but there are other forms. Citizens have to get involved, not just to demand more of their press, but also demand more of their country.
So I'm going to ask the same question of you then, right? It's twofold. How do we build on that trust? And also, what do you perceive to be the needs of the consuming public for journalism?
Well, I think that going back to even some of your preface for the question, right? I think that there are two buckets we can talk about in terms of the source of the media mistrust, right? One of which is what has been a concerted effort since the Nixon administration by one major political party to discredit the media. And that's not to say the other party doesn't also at times have a lot of things to say about us, right? But there's one party that has "Don't trust the liberal media" signs at the conventions every 4 years. The other one does not. And frankly, I think it can be. I think sometimes we can have a currency bias. Where that's not to say that our prior president did not push this beyond where other people in that office had, but he did not invent the idea among his base or Republican voters that they should not trust the press.
Agreed.
But setting all of that aside, right, forgetting that bucket for a second, I think that sometimes our internal conversation among people within the press, within the media, can be too defensive because we're true believers. We love this. We do this for a reason, right? And I think that but one line I always say is, look, no one likes the media. I'm the media. And I don't even like the media, right? Like we all talk to any journalist. They can complain about the 7 other people who covered the same story as them, the things they didn't get right, or that local TV guy who always screws this thing up, or our rival paper we understand. We have a fluency and a literacy where we understand that there is not the media, and that there are some people we definitely don't want to be associated with, and some people we would prefer to be, right? I think that one thing that's hard, especially in a world where a link is a link, right? Where any of my aunts or uncles or cousins or brothers tomorrow will open Facebook and they'll see a headline and a link and whatever it is, right? Is that there is an additional and increasing grouping of us, right? Where people are interacting with what they see the media talking about or reporting. And what we know, if I open my Facebook feed right now and click on the first 10 links that are pieces of media, 8 of them are flaming garbage, right? It's a piece of aggregation of a celebrity comment of a thing, right? That the average consumer is encountering a lot of untrustworthy media all the time, right? And so I don't think it's unreasonable that person goes, well, I don't know that I trust those people. Now, we understand that that's not the New York Times or the New Yorker or the Columbus Dispatch. But I think we also have to understand that for the average consumer, the average piece of media they're encountering probably is not trustworthy, and that might be a major source of the reason people don't trust us very much. I think that one of the major, and so what I think the challenge then for those of us who work in the more professionalized journalistic space, the folks who are really doing the work.
The legacy journalism.
Correct, right? And some of the upstarts that really want to do it well, right? Yeah. But people who are crossing the T's and dotting the I's. I think for us, there's a need, and this is hard, this isn't a new conversation, right? But there's the need for us to apply additional rigor, additional time to understand the true consequences of getting something wrong. We get something wrong, it's not that tomorrow in the paper we fix it, it's that in the first 20 minutes, the entire world has this wrong piece of information. And there are consequences to that are different than us running something on B6 and then tomorrow us being able to say, actually, never mind that, it was, or updating it, it was the news, in the new newscast, we thought it was this, but by one we know the difference. No, that piece of, that a bunch of places reported the wrong name of the Sandy Hook shooter and that there was a potential second shooter has fueled a decade of massive conspiracy theories, right? Like with real life consequences. And that's not, and I've covered a lot of mass shootings. I understand how crazy it is in those early moments, right? But the consequences of us getting anything wrong is increased exponentially because of the internet. I think the other thing, and so again, if I think part of the solution is rigor, is getting it right, is having the depth, is really answering all the questions, doing journalism that's a little less piecemeal, a little bit more comprehensive. The difficulty, I think the impediment, the barrier to that is the fact that the financial incentives in a industry that is clawing and trying to hold on is to do the opposite. We know that the best journalism is the most resource intensive, the most difficult, often not the most popular, right? It's not, and that there we have competitors who are going to rush and get the thing up, whether it's right or wrong. I talked with my students in Colorado when I was teaching at Colorado College in January, and we talked a lot about what happens when an organization or an institution, what happens when there's a conflict between its values and its interest, right? It's always in the best, it's always within the values of the best journalism to wait a day, to make another phone call, to get another detail, but in the world we live in, and I've lived in for a long time, it's almost always in the interest of the news organization to hit the button. Get it out there, be the top Google result, and so what do we do in those moments? And again, going back to the framing I said earlier, if we get to build our own journalism today, it gets to look different. We don't have to accept it the way it's set up. How might that look different? Maybe in television, noon and 7 p.m. aren't the best times to give updates. Maybe we don't have the best information, right? It's so much of how we do journalism is based on old distribution method. And that sometimes that gets in the way of, we've all written stories where we're hitting deadline, and if only we had 2 more hours, or if only we could wait till tomorrow, we'd have a better story. A more complete story, a more contextualized story. We would have reached that other person who what I might suggest is maybe we should think about, all right, so we wait. And doing that more often than perhaps we do it now.
Boy, that's a battle with editors, I don't know what to tell you.
I'm not the favorite of the editors, but it's a question of one of my best friends is one of the former White House correspondents at the Washington Post, now a political investigative reporter, and we debate this all the time because I was on the investigative staff for about a while, and he was breaking all these big scoops and all this stuff, and I was like, none of your pieces would get through my editors. What would it look like if at a newspaper most pieces had investigative? Wait, did you really reach this person? Do we really have this document? What does that really look like? How would that decrease the amount of things we get wrong? But secondarily, how would that improve the experience, the quality of experience? When you click on this piece, you know you're getting the totality of the story. How might that look different in a world, again, where we're not necessarily so beholden to every morning at 6 a.m. we put a newspaper on your front door?
Well, this is getting at part.
We talked briefly about it earlier today with students. At the end of it all, our names are on it. I mean, editors can pressure us to do all sorts of things, but our names are on it. And I tell my students often, because I come from, I did the beat reporting and all, but where I really came into it was feature writing and narrative journalism before I became a columnist. And really this works always. I think this is partly what we're talking about here. Every story, no matter how big it is really about the people in it. And that takes more reporting. That takes more time connecting those dots. But they're the pieces that endure. I want to pivot because one of the reasons, I had so many reasons for wanting both of you here, but one of them is you are 2 Black men really carving out new paths in journalism. You both have covered race. I mean, in the weeds. Just I think I always remember your Ferguson coverage is where all of a sudden every day I'm looking to see what you're coming up with next. Jamil, I've known you a long time, but I'll never forget the Black Panther cover story on Time as a seminal moment, at least in my view of your career, regardless of what you thought. I want both of you to, I'm glad to hear that, because I don't know if you've seen both. I mean, they just do this incredible work. I talk to my students a lot about the voice of authority, right? I can cover things, like as a columnist, I've written about racism my entire career. I've written a lot about the LGBTQ community and advocate, but I am an ally as a columnist. My voice of authority is limited because I'm not living the experience. And we need more journalists who have that voice of authority from their own experience, which makes editors uncomfortable. We talk about it sometimes, the more traditional ones, right? Well, it's not about us, but actually it is, I think, to a large extent. Who gets to tell the story? So are you both up for talking about that?
Oh, for sure. I mean, and related, I think, a little bit to what Wes was just talking about, I have good examples of, good editorial advice in those situations and bad editorial advice. I would say first, bad editorial advice. There was a situation, I'll get to the Time story in a minute, because that's the good one. The bad one, Jussie Smollett had just made some accusations, and there were allegations out here. We want you to write about it. Okay, well, let's take a look at what he's alleging. And I mean, I can say this now. It's easy for me to say this now, but there's a reason I didn't tweet a whole lot about it at the time. Okay, I was like,
Talk about that.
okay, I smelled BS from the jump, to be honest with you. It just didn't sound like something that actually happened.
But instead of saying that, you said nothing.
Instead of that, I said nothing because A, still standing allegations, B, racism in this country is crazy, and you never know what people might actually do. When somebody robbed and put a noose around Jussie Smollett's neck in the middle of the coldest night in Chicago, maybe, because look at what's happened with racism in this country, with racist violence in this country, what's happening right now with racist violence in this country. I couldn't rule it out, but I just felt like this is a time for me, keep my journalist hat on, be cautious, wait for the facts. And I said to my editor, listen, I understand that you want me to write about this. This is kind of right in my strike zone, but I would much, much rather not write about this, and I would much rather write about Mitch McConnell right now, which is in fact what I did. And, did a column I'm proud of about Mitch McConnell, and now there's not a column with my name on it on the internet about how Jussie Smollett made these accusations, and this is an example of the rampant increase in racist violence in this country. And you can go on the web right now. You see all the pieces that came out the day after it happened, and if these people had just waited to not just get more information, like not just find out whether or not Jussie was telling the truth, but just to understand what the context of what was happening was. Do some reporting, ask some historians, ask people who studied these kinds of things. Because we as journalists, we cannot be expected, I think, to be scholars, in the same way. Like, I'm a mother's professor. I know what a scholar knows and doesn't know. And we have to sometimes be, hey, it's okay to say, I don't know enough right now. And it's better for us to wait than to, A, get it wrong, but also, the internet lives forever. The takes live forever. You can delete a tweet, you're not gonna delete a byline. And so I'm thankful that that's one example of me waiting, and I don't think that I deserve a medal for it, but I think it's just an example. Now, if you're thinking about going in this career potentially, make sure that you stand up for what you're thinking about. I had an example when I was in the production phase of my career. A host who I will not name wanted to agree with the Bill Cosby pound cake speech. This host was white. I advised him not to do this as the only black person on his staff. Now, at that point, I felt an undue burden upon myself.
Sure, of course.
Because I knew no one else was going to stop him from doing this. Mm-hmm. And this is a very, very famous person. And I said, listen, this is before YouTube and all that, but I said, listen, you do not want this out here forever. You just don't. And I broke it down, broke down the speech, I wrote down the reasons he should probably, hold his tongue, and he, to his credit, he listened. He took me seriously, and he didn't say anything, and we're not talking about that person. There would be a Wikipedia section in that person's Wikipedia entry had he made this commentary. I'm telling you. And there isn't. And I think that, yes, that's a credit to me as a producer in that moment, but also that means he needs more people. And, and it shouldn't be upon us as Black folks in the press to make sure that we catch all this stuff. Because frankly, it's exhausting. And we need white people, primarily in this business, to be aware of these things and to understand, especially in this moment where literally the promotion of ignorance is taking over. It's, school boards, it's state houses. It's the literal promotion of ignorance. That's what is going on. And it's not about critical race theory. It's about promoting ignorance about what is actually happening and what has actually happened. And we need people to step up in this war against facts to, frankly, help people understand and reach people that we may not be able to reach. I don't know. Listen, I grew up in Ohio. I feel comfortable going to any diner in this state, but in any diner in any state, frankly. But there's a lot of folks who may not feel that comfortable, and we need y'all to do it, and we need y'all to be able to get it when you're doing it. So, getting to the positive example, I got an assignment from Time to write a story, not a cover story at the time, just a story about the upcoming movie Black Panther. We hear it's going to be big, et cetera, et cetera. We'd like you to write about it. I said, okay, it's cool to get that kind of ask, because normally I'm writing about police violence and all these terrible things that are happening in politics. It's nice to be asked to comment on something that has to do with our culture. And yes, jumped on the assignment. And wrote a first draft, was proud of it, did it in 2 days. It was a rushed assignment, but I was happy with the first draft, and they were happy with it, so much so that the editor-in-chief of Time magazine, Edward Rosenthal, was like, we would like you to actually expand this. We want you to put yourself at the top of this piece. Because I had written it's typical, what I thought was a typical Time magazine entertainment section essay, where I was thinking, okay, let's break it down. I'm gonna take like 1966, the year the comic comes out, it's the same year, the ascendance of Black Power. Let's correlate the two, maybe not, there's not any necessarily causation here, but like, let's talk about those two cultural forces being in the zeitgeist at the same time. And they loved that. And I had it at the top of the piece. I was like, okay, we're gonna start this piece with Stokely Carmichael, and people are not gonna see that coming. And in fact, he's like, no, we want to actually start this piece with Jamil Smith and what Jamil Smith thought about the movies when he was a kid. And I put an old
How did
ending.
you feel about that request? Did you hesitate?
No, not really. Because as my father will attest, we watched a lot of movies. Watched a lot of movies. So like, I was well versed in the topic. And so I said, okay, you want me to put more of myself in there? I just kind of cracked my knuckles and went after it. And the piece starts with me talking about how, the first movie I ever saw in the theater, that I remember seeing in the theater, because I don't know, they might have taken me to see Bambi or something, but it was Empire Strikes Back. And I know I'm dating myself. But, that movie had
to your left side, you'll feel much better.
That movie, don't say it, don't say
My
it.
first movie in theater was Muppet Christmas Carol.
Why is he doing
I told you not to say it. I was probably in high school. But that movie had a Black hero in it. It was a complicated Black hero, but he was interesting, and I said it stuck with me, and it really did. And that's the first thing that came to mind, was the representation that was inherent in this movie. Black heroes, Black culture, and what this movie said about, how this movie represented African futurism, anti-colonialism, all of it. It's all in that film that everyone can just go have some popcorn and enjoy, and they're all going to absorb it. And I was thankful for the opportunity.
It's a beautiful piece. I highly recommend it.
Thank you. I'm very proud of
You know how I feel about it.
it. I do.
You ready?
All right.
I don't want to hear more about the Muppets. I took my children to
I think about the role of the press or journalism media in general, right? And there are I wasn't the one who came up with this, there's a journalistic historian who did. He said fundamentally there are two roles, to provide facts and to provide the forum to debate those facts, right? And I think about in this moment, I think on every issue, we have so much more forum than we do facts. And again, part of that is because the collection and verification of facts is resource draining. It takes time. It's harder and costs more money to put Jamil on a plane to Chicago to figure out what happened with Jussie than it does to say, hey, can you write 1,000 words right now about what you think about it?
That's right.
And I think that so I don't think it's unique that on issues of race very often, I think we fall into that space as well. And that's no disparagement at my many dear friends who are some of the leading voices on these issues, right? But I think that for me, what I've always thought about, to the extent that I've had the ability to control my own book, because we all know sometimes the bosses tell us what we're doing, and then we fight it, but then still do the thing the bosses want us to do. But I think for me, very often I've tried to think about, okay, on these issues, is there a question I might ask that some of my colleagues wouldn't? Is there a fact pattern or string I might pull on that someone else wouldn't?
Is the answer almost always yes?
Very often it is. I remember when we did Fatal Force, this was coming out of Ferguson, and we launched this project to attempt to quantify how many people were being shot and killed by the police. And as we started doing this work, my editors, very good journalists, very smart people, were just shocked and aghast at the numbers they were seeing. They could not, this thing that we were finding facts that they would not have believed to be true otherwise. I was relatively agnostic about it. I wasn't. None of our findings were particularly shocking to me. I was like, yeah, this is what it is. I think that, but I think that matters, right? I think that when we talk about journalism, and we often talk about this idea of kind of an objectivity or of a process, right? But one of the things I talk about is how even objective journalism, or the best of objective journalism, is built upon a pyramid of subjective decision making. What story you go after in the first place, who you interview, what questions you ask them, and how you ask those questions, right? How you order and so for me, as I started to develop some level of expertise around particularly race and justice issues, I often try to think about what is a question or a framing or a person who otherwise would not appear here. That when I finally moved off of the news and was working primarily on investigative staffs and working primarily on enterprise pieces even now, where I'm kind of picking the magazine piece I'm doing or the segment I'm doing for CBS. But I developed this thinking when I was at the Post, where in the best of times, because I was at the Post for a few years with Obama and a few years with President Trump, in the best of times, right, the Washington Post lands on the desk of all the most powerful people in the world, and they read it. And so if in 2015, I was doing 8 front page pieces as a project for the Washington Post, I knew Barack Obama was reading it. And Valerie Jarrett was, and John Boehner was, and so for me, I thought, okay, what are the 8 stories I'm going to put on that front page that wouldn't have been there otherwise? A lot of stuff's going to be there, and anyone can write that. What are the 8 pieces, the 8 stories of some person out there in the country, the perspective, the framing, the project that wouldn't be on that front page otherwise?
Where did that confidence come from? Because you were quite young when you made that decision, when you started thinking in that way, right? So where did that confidence of your own voice come from?
I think that one of the things I give our industry, I can't really answer where my insane confidence and ambition comes from. It
was a self-awareness at a young age of your power, your potential power.
Well, because I'm really a media and journalism true believer, right? I would 100% believe in the power of words and the work that we do, and the power of, and I also have spent enough time, whether it be in Black communities, but also with other Black journalists, to know that there are big swaths of populations that do not see their realities reflected in our pages, right? For me, the other thing I would always say is when we would do a big project, this is true of Fatal Force, but it's also true of Murder with Impunity, was actually one of my favorite projects I've done, where we did this project that was looking at homicides in major American cities, but not like these are most dangerous neighborhoods. It was, I want to be able to take you to the street corner in any American city where murder is functionally legal, where people are murdered here routinely, and no one is ever arrested. And if we're talking about distrust in police, well, why would these communities trust the police? They're routinely and frequently the victims of the worst crime that can be committed, and they have no expectation of ever receiving justice. Right? I always would say, right, relationships can break down for two different sets of reasons. They can break down for the presence of bad behavior, or they break down for the failure to meet expectations, right? Your girlfriend can leave you because you cheat on her, the presence of bad behavior. She can leave you because you forget her birthday, right? And we spent a lot of
Which he never should have.
No, of course not, right? Would never be me. So but we had all this conversation for all these years about the relationship between Black communities and the police.
Yeah.
We spent a lot of time talking about the dead teenager on the street. But we're spending a lot less time, but these are taxpayers. These are people who are the most victimized, in the most need of the types of services and safety that, in the way we structure our governments currently, we task to the police.
Right.
How are they being serviced? And if we accept as a premise that these neighborhoods, these communities do not trust the police, what might the mixture of the two buckets be? Because it's not all one. So we do this project, we break this down again. I think this is another project where all the editors could not believe this thing would be true, and so we had to jump through a few more hoops than necessary probably to get this going. But then was true, and the data all bore it out, it was there. But I think about, I love this project, but I think about this all the time because when I do a project like that, where I'm attempting to tell a story that otherwise might not have been told, or from an angle that might, the way I know we've nailed it is when the project drops, the story drops, and like my Twitter feed is a bunch of like white people being like, "Can you believe this?" And a bunch of Black people being like, "Look at the Washington Post, discovered the cops never solve anything. Look at these guys." Because what it does is it means we've hit the sweet spot of telling us of a story of the two Americas. Right? We've unearthed and hit on a truth that a bunch of people didn't realize was a truth. And that I think is like one of the higher functions, one of the most important functions we have. I think that I didn't actually answer the question you asked me. But
And in part you have.
Yeah.
I want to talk about Ferguson for
Sure.
if you don't mind,
That's
because
fine.
we were all watching on television suddenly. It wasn't just you were reporting it. We were turning to you for live updates. And you were in a precarious position more than once there. And I've always wanted to ask, what was it like to be you in that moment?
I'll be honest, I was completely unprepared for it. So I was a congressional reporter, right? I covered Congress for the Post. I covered City Hall for the Boston Globe. I had spent my entire career essentially chasing 2016. I wanted to be on the trail. That was, and so, but I always had an interest in issues of race and justice. I always volunteered and raised my hand and weaseled my way into stuff that didn't really have anything to do with me. But here I am making some phone calls. And by happenstance was the person with the bag packed and got sent out first. And
There was no more strategy than that. You just were available and had the, happenstance makes.
Well, yeah, there was more strategy
So let's
because
talk
I
about
schemed. So the Michael Brown was killed on August 9th, 2014, Saturday, and I actually happened to, a dear friend of mine was a local reporter in St. Louis. She was the first reporter on the scene, and so I was seeing her updates immediately. I was in Michigan with a congressional with Justin Amash, and so I was noting it, was paying attention. And then on Saturday, a friend of mine from the LA Times got there. And so I was following his coverage a little bit too. And then, or on Sunday. And Sunday night is the night that the Quick Trip gas station is burned down. So by Monday morning, every media outlet in the country is like, we gotta send something, right? Which, again, I might know.
Not every outlet. Okay.
Sure. but I might know that the teenager dead in the street for 4 hours prompting massive protests didn't prompt me to be put on a plane, but a gas station being burned down did. And so by Monday morning, I'm back in Washington. I think I'd taken a red eye, so I literally came straight from the airport. And it's clear this is going to be one of the lead stories. Something's going on. And so I walked over to my buddy Mark Berman, who was on the national desk at the Post, and I said, "Hey man, how can I be helpful? I know the congressional delegation from Missouri. You want me to call them and see if they know anything about if DOJ is going to open anything you want me to call. I did some coverage of the push at the time to renew the Voting Rights Act. It was like I can call the NAACP or the LDF, whomever. And so again, it was, doing a thing that has served me well throughout my career, which is identifying a story that matters as important and trying to find a way to weasel into it, whether it has anything to do with your job or not. And that has served me very well. And so as we're having this conversation, as I'm volunteering labor that has nothing to do with what my actual job is on this day, an editor walks past and goes, "Hey, are you talking about this? Can you get on an airplane? We don't have anyone there." And so I went and picked up the bag I'd taken from Michigan. My grandparents live in Detroit, so my grandmother, of course, had washed all of my clothes, and so I was prepared, and went and got on the next flight to St. Louis and landed 2 hours later. And so I had, they said, not even raised my hand, placed myself in the position to be in the line of sight of the person making the decision. Got on the ground, spent the first 2 or 3 days really just trying to get a sense of what was going on. There was very little information at the time. That night, the night of the 11th, was the first night that the police there deployed tear gas and had responded much more aggressively than they had the first 2 nights, which became an emergent conversation at the time. On August 13th, myself and another reporter, Ryan Riley, of the Post, were the first 2 journalists arrested while covering Ferguson. Ultimately, there ended up being dozens, if not over 100 journalists who were arrested, so we were not special in any way, other than being the first. And on that same night, August 13th, Antonio French, who was a local elected official who had been really one of the lead sources on the ground of information. He was live blogging everything and live streaming. He gets arrested live on his live stream. Tremaine Lee gets tear gas live on MSNBC. So August 13th becomes this major spike moment. Well, what I'll say is, it was interesting, especially post-arrest. Right, I was a reporter, I was on the ground, I had some experience, I'd spent some time in both Boston, LA, and a few other places. I guess what I'd say is I'm really comfortable in Black communities. I don't have any issue. That's not gonna be an issue for me. And so it's spent, even as I'd spent a lot of my career focused on politics, done a fair amount of metro reporting. I knew how the police function largely, I knew. And so I was comfortable broadly with the basics of these stories. But what I'll also say is being thrust into the story in this way, being arrested and being on television and all the people follow you on the internet, and then you become a ping pong ball in all of this, right? And so now people are writing about how I'd set myself there to get myself arrested on purpose, or they were like trying to dig up tweets I'd sent when I was in college about Trayvon Martin, or you become a character in this, because on these issues, particularly on issues of race, but not just on issues of race, on any issue that you can make partisan, but always on issues of race, when people dislike the underlying facts, they attack the messengers extremely aggressively. And so it became this thing that if we were all just racial charlatans, and that's what was driving. That's why all these people in Ferguson are upset, is because Wesley Lowery is lying to them on Twitter. Right? And I wish I had that power. I promise you, I do not. And so it became a very, what I'll say is 2014 was very difficult. It was very hard. It was very deeply unpleasant. I was relatively new at the Washington Post. I'd only been there, started in February of that year. This is August. When we get arrested, I don't know the city. I don't know how to call my editor because I don't know their phone number. And so I was tempted between calling the numbers I had memorized were my parents' home number, the Boston Globe Metro desk, because I had come from there, and my high school girlfriend's cell phone number, which is 3 numbers. And my mom couldn't figure out how to accept the charges. And so it was an experience that was in many ways a trial by fire, but it was something that, now being almost a decade out the other side of it, there's certainly things I would maybe go back and do differently, but that as an experience, I would not give up or give away.
Sure.
Because it was so interesting and important, and I think it changes some of my perspective, even by the time we get to 2020 and George Floyd's death, by the time we get to the conversations we're having now around policing and crime and defunding the police, abolition, and what there is, having been really inside one of those news cycles once before, more than once before now, but it really provided me a little bit more perspective, I think, about how these issues manifest, how they show up, the disconnect between the political conversations and the on-the-ground conversations, the space between what people's impression based on media reporting might be and what's actually happening. I remember sitting in my hotel room sometimes in Ferguson and watching 2 buildings burn on loop, and then like going to like the brewery and like for a long walk through this suburb that is Ferguson, Missouri, right? Or when I finally got back to Cleveland to cover Tamir Rice after Darren Wilson wasn't indicted, my parents, who have followed Ferguson as closely as any other 2 humans in the world, like I've been like in it. They're like, so what's that place really like? Right? That the idea that you could even be consuming all of this, knowing that you're not actually getting it.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, I think it's been a very, it was a very strange and difficult time. Again, I was 24, right? And so I was thrust into a lot, but it really thickened my skin. It gave me some perspective. And it also, for me, like I said, I spent then the next 2 or 3 years being the guy on the airplane at every one of these, knowing all the families, doing the, and it was a big part of my transition into a more investigative enterprise space because I began seeing what felt like the limitations in storytelling, but also in adding information to the conversation from having to cover these as these incidents, as opposed to saying, what are all the things we know? What are all the things we don't know? And how can I spend a year trying to add to that stack of things we know about these topics writ large?
I so understand when you want to make that transition. That's how I ended up becoming a columnist. I got really frustrated reporting on these very big issues of justice and injustice, right? And never being able to say, and here's what you can do about it, right? Or here's what we ought to be doing about it. And we've all had those moments where we wanted to pivot. I wanted to give, I'm sorry, I haven't given the audience a chance to ask any questions. So I'm asking you now. Oh, I'm sorry, it's talking. Sorry. Questions? Yes.
I wondered, the account of your reporting for Ferguson through The View from Somewhere, Elizabeth Wallace's account of it, she kind of folds in the role of, democratic reporting and how important that was in that instance. And I just wondered from your point of view, like, how did that help you, or maybe not help you, to have so much of that incident being reported from people who were there in the streets and part of it as well?
I'm going to repeat the question as best I can. When you say democratic reporting, are we talking about citizen journalism? Okay, so how was it to be having all those other reports coming? We're seeing that now in Ukraine, right? So much of that in Ukraine. What impact did that have on your work?
So I'm really optimistic about this, although again, I think it butts right to one of the things I've talked about a few times, right? I think our role is to be the trusted, verifying, vetting force. We live in a moment where everyone has a printing press in their hand at all moments, and that their newspaper can be seen by the entire world within moments. And so our job is to go back and cross the T's and dot the I's, right? One of the things that's true, right? All this, Ferguson and many of these places, Ferguson's a stand-in for several years, reporting that I did, right? Is that you have folks who are in real time updating and talking about what's happening, documenting what's happening around them, right? In many cases, these are normal citizens who might be speaking emotionally, who might use shorthand we don't fully understand, who might not be as rigorous. Did the cop run at you, or did he walk at you, or did he sprint at you, or did he, right? We understand that when your buddy's telling you the story, he might use language that's different than if you're actually going to the dictionary, or and so I think very often, what I view in a lot of those cases is that social media is a remarkable tip sheet. It was a remarkable space to have people documenting tidbits of their experiences. And so often, when you got them on the phone, it was even richer and deeper and more complex. There was so much there. And these are folks who are self-identifying in public, hey, I've got information for you. And so for me, I really embrace that, right? The other thing I'd say is, I would say that on a beat like that, almost, in a space where I was covering these issues over and over and over again, you become a trusted voice in that space. You end up having access to folks you might not otherwise. So I would have cases where the loved ones of someone killed by the police would send me a message on Twitter because they knew me and I was in the space. Or I remember when, in 2015, the University of Missouri, student protesters ran out the president of the university. And one of those student protesters, Jonathan Butler, went on a hunger strike. And no one could reach him, no one could talk to him. And I interviewed Jonathan Butler at a protest in Ferguson the year prior. Man on the street. He was no one. He was a guy. I wanted to and talk to him. And because of that, he followed me on Twitter. So I sent him. So I unbeknownst to me, I had no idea. I'm Googling him. I'm looking him up for the first time. And so I had access to him in a way no one else did. And so we get this. So I am able to do my job in a way I could not have otherwise. Right? I think that, again, I think that I was just talking to friends about this yesterday. I think the ability for individuals to document, I think we have to completely rethink what the role of professional press is. Because everyone is the press now. And so what sets us apart, what is different about us? And again, I'm optimistic about that because that gives us a massive space and a pathway towards building that trust back. You know, I opened Twitter tonight. I don't know if the video I'm seeing from Ukraine is real or not. I really don't. Some guy said it, or like 8,000 people retweeted it. I don't really know. But if the New Yorker tells me it's real, the New York Times does, or the Post, all right, well maybe and I think in a moment like this, where we all get duped all the time, where we all don't really know what's going on, I think that is really, really a really big space for me.
Jamil, you wanted to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I think just to this point, I think one of the roles I think we need to be taking as journalists is basically just like being like more or less the editors overseeing this kind of citizen journalism. I mean, if we are to be still thought of as authoritative sources, we have to do our jobs incredibly well. And that doesn't mean that we're never going to make a mistake, but we have to, I have lots of similar connections to citizen activists, to regular folks on the street who just came out to protest, to people who were doing citizen journalism on the street and want their work, seen or recognized. I mean, frankly, at the time that this was happening, I worked for a show, Melissa Harris Perry, that was, among other things, maybe the blackest show on MSNBC at the time. And, lots of people came to us because they knew Melissa was a trusted source and understood the complexity of Black experiences in a way maybe that other shows did not. I mean, we were the first to put the Trayvon Martin story on cable television. And that's not because we're so amazingly prescient or particularly understanding of the moment. No, it's because I saw an article by Tremaine Lee in the Huffington Post reporting on this, and I said, this is really important. Melissa's like, yeah, this is really important. Let's talk about it. It was that simple. And people understand that we were putting on the air stories that related to their experiences in ways that truly reflected their realities. And if we continue to do that, we can take in these videos, and we can, as long as we're not just regurgitating them, which I think, unfortunately, too many of our colleagues in the press do, as long as we're not just regurgitating them and say, here, look, be shocked. We need to be doing is saying, okay, we see this video, let's do the journalism on it. And that's our job. That's not their job. Because their jobs are something else. They're, and the democracy of the internet allows them to just say whatever the hell they want, which, it's not yet. They're not held to a professional standard that we have chosen to hold ourselves to. So then we need to then make sure that we do that for ourselves. Because we can't just say, oh, well, I saw this, some guy tweeted it, and I just retweeted it, No, that doesn't, I'm sorry, like I'm kind of a stickler about this. It just doesn't fly, Like have I done it in the past? Yes. Have I learned from screwing up? Yes. But we all need to learn from that. And at this point, I mean, that excuse might have flown in 2012. It does not fly in 2022.
Building off of that, I think that, again, Kevin Merrido, who's now the editor of the LA Times, used to be the managing editor at the Washington Post, and he would very famously, Kevin is, for folks who don't know him, is this very calm, cool, collected. He was in the tradition of the managing editor. He was the one who kind of had the pulse of the room and was figuring out what was going on, and so every problem ended up in his office. And he would very famously, when there was a dispute about whether a story was ready to publish or not, or how should we lead it, or what should we, he would always go, well, it sounds like we need more reporting, and end the meeting. And I think about that often, and I think about that in my own pieces, my own work, right? But I also think about that in these moments where something is happening, where the news is breaking, where things are moving quickly. I was thinking about when Philando Castile died in 2016. And the video was going viral. Alton Sterling had been killed the night before in Baton Rouge. And so that video had gone viral. I spent the whole day adjudicating and dealing with that. And then we just put this piece to bed for the front page of the Washington Post on what was going on in Baton Rouge. And I was coordinating with freelancers down there as this video goes online of Philando Castile. And it's miserable. And but I remember, and this is what I always say when I talk about even why I did this reporting for a long time, was that when you see a video like that, the human response, the human reaction, this is why we see so much, I think it's why we see so much being said online, is you want to do something or say something. You're upset by it. How could you not? You just watch someone be killed, right? And so there's this desire, this very human, natural desire. You want to do something, you want to say something, and what I appreciate about the role of the reporter, the journalist, is there's something to do in that moment. Right? At the time, we didn't even know Philando Castile's name. There was someone on the internet said, maybe it's this guy. And so it was my job to, a few moments later, be on the phone with his sister, who was still in the emergency room, with him. And so again, for me, at least, it's a means of expending the energy in a productive way. It's a means of providing all these other people who've been upset and traumatized by this video, and in part are upset that they don't even know this guy's name yet. Like, who is he? Well, all right, I can help solve that. Like, that is a thing I can do now, right? And start to get some basic information about who he was and what happened and how do we, and so I think that is, and again, I think that is what we, in this moment, we interact with so much news, with so much media, but so little follow-up on it. Now, we were always going to find out Philando Castile's name. There were always going to be profiles of him,
Well, what you're talking about is what is your default setting? And your default setting, if you're a journalist, should be you immediately want more information.
Yes,
That's our default setting.
100%.
Yeah.
And I just have one real quick thing.
Okay, now listen, you two.
All
right, because we gotta take.
I don't know. I don't want to deprive the people of their time to ask questions. I mean, that's the thing. Is like I think we have to guard as journalists ourselves against getting sucked into a political moment. I mean, yes, it was important that we find out names of these people: Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling. I mean, Tamir Rice. There are names that, frankly, we had to keep saying because we got evidence time and time again that people in this country do not care what these people's names are, who do not care about the humanity of these people. So we spent so much time reinforcing that point, I think, to a certain extent, that we didn't maybe do enough about humanizing them. And I think that's our jobs. It's not public's jobs to humanize. Public's jobs is to say their name, make sure people understand and never forget them. Our job is to make sure that people know them the best that they can, know these people, know who they were, know what their lives were, know what actually happened in those situations. Because, I mean, part of the reason I am a journalist is I had a family who was a victim of violent crime when I was young, and there was nothing in the paper about it. Not one time did I see his name in the paper. And I've never forgotten that. And it's our job not to just put the name in the paper, but also put the story behind the name.
Well said. It was good, and I'm glad you said it. Other questions? Yes.
Yes. First off, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate this. As 3 seniors who are currently getting ready to graduate in May, I just want to shift gears a little bit and hear about if you were a hiring manager in a newsroom, looking for a journalist to be on your team or do storytellers, what would you be looking for? What would stand a candidate? What would make them stand out from another candidate who's in that role?
What is your name?
Ray.
Ray. So the question from Ray, who is a soon-to-graduate senior, guess I'll see you at commencement, and I'm sorry for that, is if you're in the position right now to be hiring journalists, am I getting this right?
Yeah.
what would you be looking for in them? What do you value most in them as candidates? Is that fair, Ray? Is that good? Okay.
Okay. First things first, intellectual honesty. That to me, can you interrogate either a perspective or an argument, and can you put that forth, accepting first of all that you may be wrong, or there may be other perspectives that you need to incorporate, that you need to do more reporting, or if you're doing, say, an opinion piece, will you be able to, be engaged in intellectually honest debate about what, is there going to be people who disagree with you, disagree with your reporting, disagree with your opinions, and can you engage with them in a way that helps people stimulate conversation that's productive and constructive? That's one thing. Number two, obviously, you got to be professional. Can you hit your deadlines? Can you come up with creative pitches and stuff that is maybe adding something to my publication that we don't have? Because ultimately, people aren't just necessarily plugging people in as cogs. Like, okay, we need, a Metro reporter to just do the same thing Metro reporters always do. No, you are bringing your particular lens to that situation. You are bringing your experiences to that situation. Make sure that they understand the value of your lived experience. Especially as men of color in this industry, they understand what it's like to say, go to Tamir Rice, the place where Tamir Rice was shot 3 weeks after it happened, and still see the frozen tire tracks in the mud. Because I happened to be home, and that's what I did. But me putting that in a column as a black, former black kid who grew up in Cleveland as a black boy, that has a different resonance than it might for somebody else. Help them understand the power of your own perspective.
Before I pass it to Wes, I want to mention something about both of them. I hope you're noticing as they talk about how important it is that they show up in all different kinds of ways, whether it's at the city desk, whether it's going into a conversation that was a whole lot of none of your business, but if you make it, right? Going when you have time to go see the tire track, they show up. And I just want to acknowledge this about both of them, because it's one of the things I most admire in both of them for their journalism. They are not waiting for the invitation. They are creating the opportunity for them to tell the deeper story.
And I think the thing I'd add to that, I agree with all that. I think the thing I'd add to that is that for me, this has served me well. I think of journalism in a lot of ways as a trade, much more than an academic pursuit, right? And you look at the things that are at the core of what we do, coming up with a story idea, researching it, interviewing people, writing, and telling that story, right? And these are all things that get better with repetition. Every person is better at their 1,000th interview than their first interview. There are stories with my byline on them in the package that won the Pulitzer Prize that I would take back today and make some edits to, right? 100%. The best written piece I've ever written, there's a sentence in it that I'm like, man, why did I just and so, but I say all that to say, you get the ability, even if you've done nothing, you switched into journalism yesterday, right? And now you're graduating in May. All right, you got 2 months. You can interview someone every day between now and then. You can write 6 pieces between now and then, right? And I think a big part of it, right? If you can get it, so much of it's kind of proof of concept, right? So much of it's showing folks that you can do the work and show up and do it, right? And I think that because if you can do it, if you can do those fundamentals, and if you can build on those fundamentals, it's going to give you additional options no matter what. And so that's one of the things I always really encourage students, whether they're on their first day on campus or last day on campus, is be thinking about how do you show that you can do the work? And today, there's more opportunity to do that than ever before, right? It's not that there's 2 papers in town taking 4 interns, right? You can write the smartest pieces for any number of campus publications, for your own publication, in your own space, and so I think that putting those repetitions in and showing that you can do that work is really, really valuable. Because if I can trust you on the fundamentals, I can guide you to the rest of it, right? At the Post, particularly when I was on the national desk, I worked with a lot of our interns, I worked with a lot of our freelancers around the country, right? And so I worked with folks of all types of varying talent levels. But if I knew, hey, can you call these 3 people and ask them these 4 things, they could come back and deliver that, I can deal with the rest of the stuff, right? And then by the time we had to do it again, they will have learned the next 2 things I need them to do, or the next thing. And so I think that, but I can't teach you I can't sit next to you on the phone. I can't do this if this is interview 1 for you, right? And so I think that's a big part of it, is like putting in some of that work, doing those repetitions. And then wherever you end up, right? Because none of us, very, very few of us end up in our first or second job in the job we want, or the job we will, or what will be a forever job, if even such a thing exists. But the other thing is, in each of those early jobs or those early positions, or the internship or whatever it is what is the thing that I've been sent here to learn how to do here, right? And who is the person I'm supposed to learn how to do things from here? Alan Miller's gonna like this example I'm about to give, but I still think about, I do a lot of public records-based work. And every time I send off a records request, I think of Randy Ludlow, who I used to sit next to, who was a total character at the Dispatch, extremely talented journalist, but who did who every day I was watching send off requests and argue with someone, so why haven't you given this to me yet? And I knew at the time, even if I wasn't getting all these other great experiences interning at the Dispatch, that I had been sent there to learn how to copy these 4 specific things from this guy, right? And 15 years later, every day I am doing things like traits I directly stole from someone better than me. And so, because so much of being talented at almost anything is about an imitation, it's learning from the people who are experts at it, right? And so no matter where you end up, a small local, a website, what's the thing you've been sent here to learn? And how do you put that tool in your toolbox? Because then when you move on to the next thing, you've got that tool. You can still do it. And I think that part of it's really important.
One of the things I would add to this is wherever you get hired, wherever you're working, in any current job, we all have editors who we can't believe have to edit our work. But you look for the ones who you know can help you grow, and most places have them, and they're usually very open. Sometimes you have to be very subversive about it. I'm definitely guilty of that. But I knew I wanted to grow, and I found the editors who could help me do that. And I still reported to the people I couldn't believe were editing my work. Okay, one more question. Do we have time for one more question? Are you guys okay?
Well, how about you both ask?
All right, you both can. All right, is that okay, Mike? Okay.
Okay. So basically, one of the things that we were talking about earlier, that concept of how do we build trust with people who have lost trust in journalism. But I know that there are a lot of communities that never trust journalism. I know especially I've been learning a lot about Indigenous communities and reporting on Indigenous communities and how a lot of those communities have been done wrong for decades. And so one of the things that I think is really interesting is this concept of, instead of treating journalism like a window to look into a community, doing the journalism for the community. And I was just wondering if you guys have any experiences where you really feel like you were doing journalism for the community and you were really serving the people that you were reporting on, because I think that's the kind of reporting that we all want to do.
What is your first name? Eileen. Let me make sure I'm getting this right. Are there instances where you have written about a particular community where you felt you were really serving that community in the reporting? Is that the right way to put it?
Yes. First, yes. One time I was working for Rolling Stone, and I went to a women's prison in California to report on a concert that Common was doing for those women. And the concert gave me the Rolling Stone excuse to do it. But I was doing that report to illuminate the stories of these women who were incarcerated and try to help them, help people understand that this one brief moment of joy can help encapsulate that in a piece. That's a more serious version of that. I would say also, there was a less serious version is when Cory Booker decided to go to Comic-Con in the middle of a presidential campaign. And I got a tip from a friend who works at Marvel's, Booker's coming down to San Diego. I get on a train from LA, where I was living at the time, and I go see Cory Booker, who I'd interviewed before. Thankfully, I had a little bit of a good rapport with him. And this man was just like, he was a big and slop. He just enjoyed every single moment of this. And I just took pleasure, not just in my community there was my fellow nerds. I'm served, like Cory Booker yes, is one of us, and here he is doing the, Vulcan with the Star Trek, and he was just in it. He was in it. I loved it. But at the same time, I cannot do that piece without taking the community he's a part of, the community that we're all a part of, this kind of comic book nerd, very seriously in trying to tell that story for those people, and because I could have gone there and just been like, yeah, here's a presidential candidate walking around a bunch of freaks wearing stormtrooper outfits and wizard costumes, and being like, hey, what is he doing here? What if any of us doing here? But I would have looked at my movie collection, and I would have said, oh, I know what I'm doing here. Long story short is that you just have to take the communities that you're covering seriously, even if you don't have to take every bit of your story seriously. Even if your story isn't serious, you have to take the people who you're writing about and for. I think, frankly, it's got to be the same thing. You're writing about them, but you're also writing for them, because you are representing their perspective to people who never ever set foot in their communities, never talked to any of them, don't know anything about them. That's what you're doing.
Thank you. Wes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think as we think and talk a lot about who we do our journalism for, right? I think this comes up a lot. Am I sending a dispatch from this place that I accept as a premise my readers are unfamiliar with? Or am I attempting to do the journalism that the people in this place that I have been sent are most need, right? And those are very different things. And I think so one example I'd give is I've been doing some work with the Marshall Project, and they're doing work now in Cleveland. And I'm working with them on a project called Testify, where we're working with criminal court data in Cuyahoga County and looking at how outcomes for various elected judges, outcomes for different sentences, and we thought about this. We all this data work, got all this information that was ostensibly public, kind of, but not really, and so we're able to say some things that you couldn't really say before. But we've had a lot of conversations about, well, okay, but this information is vital to a specific affected community, right? To justice affected people likely to appear in court, to be incarcerated. So what do we know about them? Right? Because the traditional thing to do is that I would write some 10,000-word piece that no one but other newspaper reporters would read, and then maybe the Pulitzer Prize judges, right? And that would be how we would do this. Well, in a city with a 40% literacy rate, that's not an effective way to communicate about what's happening inside the court. If we have information people need, how do we think about how we get that information to them, right? And so we did all these partnerships with local Cleveland outlets, with the radio stations, and not just NPR, the hip hop station, and the local CSU station. We had a comic illustrate our findings that we then ran in Scene and put on Instagram, and had all of this idea of like, all right, if we are sitting on this vital information that people need, how do we make sure we actually get the information to them, right? That's a totally different question.
Yeah.
Then how do we get the information to the people who already subscribe to us or are already coming here or already? And so I think that that's a big, and it's I'll be honest, it's totally different. The process is totally different than any other major project I've ever worked on. The conversations we're having are totally different in terms of like what actually makes the most sense to get this piece of information to someone else, right?
Are you gonna do a print edition of that? Do you know of any sort?
So each of the pieces is going to run in Scene.
Oh, that's great. 'Cause
Yes.
I have a thought on that for you.
But I think we'll probably at some point collect. But we're also thinking about, for example, right? If part of what we're doing is trying to create public information around how the criminal courts work, right? Should we be creating a one-pager with all these results that sit at the clerk's office, or like if our job is actually to get information to the public as like a public institution or service, right? How do we distribute that information? And how might that look different than kind of the traditional ways we've thought about that
I'm
journalism?
sitting on pins and needles here. I want to share a story. Because we stumbled upon this. Mike mentioned in the introduction about this series I did called The Burden of Innocence. And it was about a black man named Michael Green who had served 13 years in prison for a rape he didn't commit. And I worked on it, I followed him for a year. And when the series came out, it was 5 days, right? Page 1 or maybe 6. The first day it came out, and Michael was from Cleveland. We knew that he was a hero for those who had already heard about him.
because he had refused, if he had said he had committed it at any number of these parole board meetings, if he had just said, I did it, they would have let him out. But he wasn't going to do that because he hadn't committed it. And then I started getting calls from doctors at the community health centers saying, hey, do you have more copies of that? Because our patients are eating it up. And when they come in, we try to keep them as long as we can, and we get their blood pressure, we can do a blood test. So I talked to our editor, we talked to the distributor, we started delivering stacks of these stories in all the community centers, all the places where they were serving the community. And it was so rewarding because we were, even listening to the editors, the managing editor at the time was referring to them as mopes. That, the mopes aren't going to even read this. And to me, that was just outright racist. And you could imagine the in-house stuff that was going on between him and me, and then my editor trying to intervene, just let's get the story out. It made such a difference to physically drop it into the communities where we knew that people were gathering. Barbershops were another, and the beauty salons. We couldn't keep, they just ran out. It was impossible to deliver too big of a stack. I would say that's one of the keys here. When you're reporting on underserved communities, they don't have the same access to wireless or computers, right? We know this, we live in the city of Cleveland, zip code 44105. We're looking at the data all the time. We're seeing it play out all around us. So it's such an important question you're asking. It is about coverage, but as Wes hit upon, it's also how do you get it to the people who most need to know that we're actually out there for them, that we're advocating, that we're writing for them, which does require us to be activists as journalists. And I remember talking about this years ago, Pointer, and a journalist just requoted, and I said, we need to become, I wasn't saying political activists, I was saying, we must become activists for journalism. We've got to start advocating for journalism. And Trump comes in, and I think we've gotten that a little bit better, but we're not great at it yet. All right, one more question. And what is your name, please?
My name is Aditi.
Aditi?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. I've really enjoyed this so far. I just had two quick things. So one thing about the Fatal Force Project, I've been following it for a while. So I just want to say, I actually was in a data story for it just a few weeks ago, and I really loved the way it was documented with the meta code and the documentation, the analysis. It was just written so accessibly to people who might not understand data. And kind of going off of that, I'm curious about data and journalism and how it intersects. How do you, for example, with this project, when I was reading up on it, a lot of the data came from tips, right? So a bunch of different stories. So how do you take a collection of stories and then quantify it and then do all this analysis where you see these trends and you see these clusters and understand things from a big picture, but kind of still maintain the depth and the humanness of each story?
Oh, so that's a great question. I'm going to try to repeat it by a little short form here. How do we incorporate all the data that we can accumulate and turn it into stories about human beings still, right? How do we marry the two? Is that a good way to ask it, do you think? Yeah. I'll start with Wes this time, and then I'll come to you, Jamil.
Well, first of all, thank you for using the database. We appreciate it. Really briefly, just for folks who might not be as aware, it's a Fatal Force is a project that's still ongoing at the Washington Post, where we launched in early 2015, seeking to quantify how many people are shot and killed by the police. There had been this massive public conversation following Ferguson, following Eric Gardner, following Tamir Rice about police killing people. And there was this debate about, is it happening every day? Is it an epidemic in the streets of black men are being killed by the police? Or is it a thing that almost never happens? Most officers never fire their guns. And we realized there was not information at a national level that actually quantified that. Here in 2014, which is not the Stone Ages, right? We all had iPhones, right? We didn't know how many people the armed agents of the government were killing every day. That seems like a pretty basic fact. This is not about whether these are justified or not. It's just the number. What is it? So we began looking at how we might quantify this. And there were a few citizen journalism groups who've done this and were doing it. And what they told us and what we saw was that you couldn't do this through public records, which is kind of the natural newspaper journalism way to do it, because there are 18,000 police departments in the country, some in 50 states that have very different public records laws. You would never actually get the answer. You'd spend an entire year sending 18,000 records requests, right? But what we saw is that throughout most of the country, in all the country actually, that when someone is shot and killed by a police officer, it's written about at least one time. And so what we had set up, myself and the researchers, Julie Tate and Jennifer Jenkins, who are geniuses, we basically set up an elaborate series of Google alerts. And every day we would check for any local media report anywhere in the country, killed by police, shot by the police, officer involved shooting, and that was it, and that would be the first line and so now we know, okay, in Philadelphia yesterday there was a shooting. And even if that shooting never got followed up on, we could then follow up on it. We knew it existed.
Right.
We could start asking the additional follow-up questions.
Which gets to the humanity of it.
Exactly. And so we do all this, and I will note, at the time, and that this has now become pattern and practice, not just the Post, but elsewhere, and it's one of the things that I'm actually most proud of, is that I still remember in the old Washington Post, we're in the Ben Bradley conference room, we're having this discussion about what we're gonna do with this data, how much of it we're gonna publish, we're doing this database in real time, and there was a real spirited discussion about this. This was the way we would think back then, right? If we publish all of our data, well, can the New York Times come in and just do a piece off of our data and scoop us on our own prestige project? And look, and sometimes that's the way newsrooms talk and think about their big things they're devoting resources to. And a handful of us, Stephen Rich, our data editor, Phoebe Connolly, myself, were really adamant that like the work we wanted to do here was going to be a public service, that we're trying to provide a utility. And so this needs to be available to everyone. And also, because of the nature of how we're doing this, we want people to be able to write into us and tell us we got something wrong. We want people to be able to run their own analysis of this. We want, and what else? And so we won the fight, and that has now become the way the Post almost always does its data projects. They did a remarkably impressive project, the Opioid Files, a few years back, where they sued and got all these records about the prescriptions that had been given out on opioids, and packaged all of this so that local news organizations could use it. When we did Murder with Impunity and we did a decade of murder homicide, and we offered our city-specific analysis to all the places, because we weren't going to do a deep dive into Tulsa. It was one of our cities, but we already fought the fight. We got all the records, we had all the information. Here, have it. Do whatever journalism you want off of it, right? And so I think that is so. When I think about these data projects, and this is true in this Marshall project we're doing too, is how are we using the resources that we have journalistically? Again, I've been blessed to be in places like the Washington Post, owned by the richest guy in the history of humanity, right? But how do we use some of his money to put more information into the public? Because we can sue this department and get this piece of information. And let's not hoard that for ourselves. The second part, and then I'll shut up, is that I do think that, again, it's not just about the numbers, it's about the people. It's about going and finding and telling these stories and humanizing, right? And we spent a lot of time on these projects doing that work and thinking about how we were going to best do it. We didn't set out to find the worst police shooting in the country. When we were really deliberate in that project, that we let the data and the statistical analysis determine the anecdotes we were using, right? And so we wrote about a lot of white people. There's a lot of white people that killed by the police. And that's important. We wrote about cases where people were armed with guns, where people were, it was not these are the 7 worst police shootings we found. Now look, well, the database surfaced a case worth looking at, we looked at them. And we reported them and included them, right? But the thought was, how do we be intellectually honest about what we're finding and what we're seeing? Because again, we saw, to the point that was made earlier, right? I do believe that journalism is a form of activism, right? We're activists on behalf of the truth, on behalf of information, right? I say the public has the right to know this. That's my opinion. Because there are people, and we see it, who say, no, the public doesn't. Every time I go to the public records guy and have to haggle with him about whether or not this thing's going to be released, I'm taking a side on the issue. And someone else is taking the other side. I'm not neutral. The public should know this information. And so for me, none of that work was advocating for a specific policy change, for a specific type of, it was advocating for us to have more information about some of the most powerful people in our government. What I always say is, for the average person, right? Because I live in Washington, right? I know members of Congress, I interact with people who are hyper powerful in the official way. But the average American, the most powerful person they'll ever interact with in their entire life is the police officer who pulls them over. So that person has the power to shoot them and kill them. And so for me, our advocacy here was about having more information about that form of government, about what the outcomes were, about what was happening there, right? And to tell the real stories of what was happening. One more thing, then I'll actually. Murder with Impunity, the project we did on unsolved homicides, right? We were really deliberate again about, because look, every newspaper every other year does a homicide project. And what we also know is that homicide in general is the most overdeveloped narrative thematic thing, right? We turn a TV on right now, and it's CSI on one channel, and it's SVU on another channel, and it's another SVU on another channel, and it's the local news talking about a murder, then it's 2020 doing about a murder, right? We've spent, like, the police, the homicide detective is the most overdeveloped character in the history of cinema, and so we had a lot of conversations about how is this different? How do we tell these stories differently? How is it not a bunch of pictures of the moms holding the pictures of the, because we literally have a journalistic trope around it. We've done so much of it. And I remember we got to, one of my favorite stories in that series was a piece I did from Richmond, Virginia. Richmond, Virginia has one of the highest solve rates on homicides. They're the good guys relatively in our end. But I wanted to do a piece there where, what we know is that in most homicides, the police believe they know who the person is. Now, whether they think they have enough evidence, whether they have, but in most cases, no one who witnessed the crime is willing to talk to them. This is actually true. Right? This isn't the cultural war, stop snitch thinking. It's that in most cases, the cop's like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that guy did it. Now, no one's going to tell me that. I can't actually charge him, but I think it's that guy. And so I wanted to do a piece that looked at that idea. So instead of talking to a bunch of cops about how no one will talk to them, I found a case that had turned on one cooperating witness and went and tracked him down in witness protection and sat and talked to him about why he decided to participate. So we told this narrative story of Kenneth Moore and his wife who witnessed a murder and have to decide if they're going to cooperate and the repercussions that come into their life because of it. Right? And so it was a story that we had the reporting, we had the data, we could have done it any number of ways. The feedback we got on that piece, because people could see and hear him and see what some of the repercussions were for him, it was one of the pieces I got some of the largest response to. And so again, I think that I'm a big advocate for data and public data, for us using journalistic resource to create that data when it doesn't exist. But as we know, I'm not a numbers guy. You tell me a story, and you got me. And I say, so I think that's something that's really important too.
Thank you. Jamil.
Just what I would add to that is simply, as a former cable news producer, essentially with cable news, to a large extent, there are exceptions to this, but cable news is largely aggregation of other people's reporting. And then you are digesting that and trying to then make something that is beneficial for your audience, ideally. So I'm going to take other people's reporting, say Fatal Force, and I'm going to use the data, not just to simply regurgitate that data, although that would be useful to the public, but also to then expand upon that by talking to actual people, to bring forth, I'd say, individual stories or collective stories. I can't tell you how many times that we talked about something like, sexual abuse or rape on shows like Melissa's, where we quoted all the statistics, rain about how many people who commit these crimes are never actually convicted, all these different things. But we did those things in the service of conversations that help people embolden and expand their understanding of the problem at hand. I can regurgitate a statistic off of from rain or from all these different if you talk about abortion, for instance, you can go to NARAL or any of these other organizations and get all the statistics that you need, but that isn't necessarily going to hit people in the head as much as somebody's story.
The voice.
Yeah, and that is what you can do if you don't have to be a front reporter. It's also not Wesley's job to do that while he's compiling that data. It is the rest of our jobs in our different capacities, being as opinion columnist, for instance, or as cable news producer, to then illuminate that. And that, as much as I give, it is important that we give, just like you did at the beginning here, to give people credit for what they've done. It is so important for those of us in this community to shine light on each other's successes. And that's why when you had that series in Cleveland, and I saw that, my mouth just dropped. I was like, that's amazing. She's doing this thing with the Marshall Project. This is about our hometown. And I just went on Instagram, Twitter, and I made sure that, like, I don't use Twitter as much as any these days, but I want to make sure that I used it for that. And that's one way I can do it. But at the same time, I also pitched it to my editors and said, like, hey, I'd like to write about this. Now, I'm distracted by other things, and other things do happen, and I'm still disappointed that I didn't get a chance to do that. But that being said, that's not gonna be my last opportunity. You have to keep pressing.
Go ahead.
You have been a wonderful audience tonight. Can you please join me in thanking